When the U.S. Civil War began, there was no shortage of recruits, because many Americans, driven by patriotism, brought up the cause of the Union. However, after a few years, the pools of recruitment quickly dried up, and colonels had to go to greater lengths to find recruits. As a result, many launched ad campaigns trying to call upon patriotism and other rationales for good wages to bring about new Americans to fight in the conflict. However, for Colonel Arthur Rankin and his ad campaign, he did not recruit in the U.S., but rather published more than 1,200 of these posters throughout the upper regions of Canada. However, this attempt to recruit Canadians into the conflict is far from novel, as more than 40,000 Canadians out of the 600,000 Americans that fought in the war participated, making up a major portion of the Union Army. My name is Nicholas Blaine, and my research interest is involving how foreign nations became involved in the U.S. Civil War and other capacities. Now, seminal authors like James McPherson and Robert Winks talk about how Canadians did fight in the war. But what they don't explain is why. By looking at their journal entries, their obituaries, their letters they wrote home, these 40,000 Canadians paint a very interesting picture of why they participated in this war. And as a result, we must ask our research question. For what reasons, be it political, social, or moral, did Canadians feel strongly enough to venture south of the border to fight in the U.S. Civil War? And the answer we'll explore today is fourfold. First, they ventured down for increased wages. Second, for a sense of adventure. Third, for abolitionism. And finally, over the fear of U.S. imperialism. And by looking at these four key reasons, they may not be all-encompassing, as many Canadians had different reasonings. However, they do paint an overarching unique picture as to why our friends to the north helped us keep our country together. Now, in considering the role of wages, it's important to recognize that this issue is far more prevalent than you might think. Now, while it's easy to suggest that, of course, making money is a good reason to get involved in a war, it was certainly the case for many Canadians. At this time period, Canada was experiencing economic depression. Industrialization that occurred in the U.S. didn't occur so fluidly in Canada, and as a result, many farms were taken away by the government, but now replaced with factories, leaving thousands out of work. As a result, many ventured south of the border to find work in U.S. factories, but unfortunately, this work was short-lived. However, when the war broke out, it was a godsend for many Canadians, as they quickly became employed by the U.S. government, make some quick money, and keep their families going. As a result, many units in the upper regions of New York were predominantly French-speaking, as they were dominated by Canadians. Now, despite the fact that the U.S. had policies against recruiting soldiers who couldn't speak English, they more or less ignored these policies because they simply needed men. Now, the wages being offered to these soldiers were incredibly high, particularly for Canadians. Because after a few years the U.S. was becoming very dire to have more recruits, they offered massive recruitment bonuses, up to $100 to $400 for recruits who joined the Army. This led to many Canadians wanting to come down, as they profited more from the war than the average American. But second, much like their American counterparts, many Canadians joined the war effort for the sense of adventure it brought to them. For most Canadians, they had never even known what war was or had served in the armed forces. The previous war that occurred in British North America, modern-day Canada, was the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This conflict produced very little bloodshed and occurred about 100 years before the U.S. Civil War. And as a result, very few Canadians knew what war was. The opportunity to go off on a grand adventure enticed many to leave, as some Canadians claimed that their primary reason for going was for glory, to bring back stories to home of how they helped to keep the United States together and how they pursued a grand adventure. Now, while again this reasoning is very close to the U.S. soldiers' reasoning, for many, it illustrates how the U.S. and Canada had a close connection and how their rationales for joining the war were often very similar, showing that how the U.S. and Canada have a long history that often interconnects. The third reason many joined was for the goal of abolitionism, and of course this didn't become prevalent until after 1863, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it's important to note that in the Canada, which was dominated by the British at the time, slavery had been outlawed in 1832, and many Canadians didn't see a need for slavery in their country, as it never became popular because it didn't make economical sense. Growing a cash crop like cotton didn't work in Canada, and as a result, it simply wasn't done and there was little need for slavery. As a result of also this issue, as well as the Catholic Church, many Canadians ventured south. The Catholic Church espoused the horrors of slavery, and that the Canadians fighting in the war were in fact doing good, even though they're being slaughtered by the thousands. Now, the intentions of the Catholic Church are somewhat muddled, as some believe that they themselves were trying to keep Canadians out of the war. But however, they actually push more into them, because even though they focus on the horrors of the war, they also emphasize the good that was being done by these Christians who were helping to free the slaves. And as a result, even more Canadians were pushed into the war in 1863 than in any other year combined, largely because of the influence of the Church. And finally, and kind of ironically, many Canadians fought in the war because of a fear of U.S. imperialism. For many Canadians, many remember the invasions of 1813, where the U.S. attempted to take Canada for a third time in its history. And the fear of being taken over by the Union Army was real in their minds. The real fear that many Canadians experienced was that the U.S. would quickly crush the South and then turn their army north, taking additional territory for the U.S. As a result, many Canadians joined the forces, hoping that their goodwill toward the U.S. would stop the United States from wanting to take over their country. In fact, a soldier by the name of Newton Wolverton actually approached Lincoln with a letter of protest, arguing that they do not want Canadians to have to fight against other Canadians. Basically, the argument was that because so many Canadians were serving, it would be unfair to invade Canada, because you'd be using their own brothers and sisters to fight their own country. Now, in actuality, Lincoln had no plans to invade Canada, at least documented in his diary or any of his letters. But the fear amongst Canadians were real, and many posited that if they were to join the war effort, they could abate a U.S. giant by supporting them. In looking at these four key reasons for why Canadians joined the war, it's important to recognize that these aren't mutually exclusive or necessarily cover every possible reason, but they're the four dominant reasons that emerge in the literature. More research needs to be done on this topic because many of the questions regarding the war aren't fully resolved with the literature presently available. By looking into more French-speaking sources that may not be able to be easily translated for the average scholar, additional research can be conducted to foster more additional learning. So what's important to recognize is that the Canadians had a unique perspective of international relations, that it was far ahead of their time, recognizing the implications of what was happening in America and how it could affect their country. And now the reasons that they may have fought in the war are solely their own and are known only to them. Hopefully, the historians can one day understand.